Well, thanks for sticking around. It's a pretty late session today, and it's a Saturday. I just wanted to. I'm going to make this a little bit of a technical keynote. The keynotes that I've gone to, they're a lot of fun and very little substance. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of fun, hopefully, though accessibility is a very dry topic, and then follow with a little bit of substance. So, not just about vision impairments. In fact, when it comes to accessibility, there are about, in terms of Australians, there are about 300,000 people in Australia that have a severe, moderate or mild vision impairment. That doesn't include the need to use glasses. And there are about 2 million people that have some kind of cognitive disability, such as dyslexia or some kind of reading disability. So it's important to know that when you're dealing with accessibility, it's not just about vision impairments. And the one reason I'd really like to emphasise to you why accessibility is important is it really gives you the option, the ability to change someone's life. So technology today can actually mean that people can do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So in Second Life, you can actually mimic the disability that you have, whether it's blindness or whether you're in a wheelchair or whatever. And there are even clubs there called wheelies, which anyone's allowed to go to, but it kind of attracts people with disabilities. And there have been cases, there's a great video if anyone's interested, by a woman who has a severe disability. She comes home from work, she goes on Second Life, she goes to a nightclub as a norm, as a person without a disability, and she interacts with people and has a good time. And she always makes it her mission to then go back as a person in a wheelchair. And she says 9 times out of 10, the same people that were talking to her before won't talk to her because she's in a wheelchair. Now, if you think about it, her being in a wheelchair in Second Life is about pixels. Like, it's not actually, it doesn't change any way that she would interact with people. But the ability for her to mimic or not mimic her disability in Second Life gives her an option that isn't available in real life. And technology is now of the point where there are people who are so severely disabled that they can't actually move, and they can use things like eye tracking software to interact and do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, whether that's internet banking or reading the news or World of Warcraft. So it really is, it's a passion of mine, as you may have gathered, and hopefully I've convinced you as to why accessibility is important. So now we get into the technical part, and I just want to talk about the differences between WCAG1 and WCAG2. Who here is familiar with the term WCAG1? Okay, how about who's not familiar with the term WCAG1? Okay, excellent. Okay, so when it comes to accessibility, I'll do a brief introduction. Accessibility is specifically about making sure websites can be used by people with disabilities. It's a legal requirement under the Australian Human Rights Commission Disability Discrimination Act, and they recommend that you use a set of guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are 2 versions of these guidelines, WCAG1 and WCAG2. WCAG1 was released in 1999. WCAG2, which I spent 6 years developing with the W3C, was released in 2008. The Australian government has endorsed WCAG2, so you should be following WCAG2 when it comes to dealing with accessibility. WCAG1 was quite prescriptive in terms of it saying, you need to use alt attributes on images, you should code lists in a particular way, that kind of stuff. It was a lot about code. WCAG2 is technology neutral, so it's a little bit harder to understand, and there's a lot of complexity in terms of documentation. So there actually are quite a few documents. If you add them all up, I think they add up to about 2,000 pages. So it's not really something that you would expect that everyone to get their head around. They start with principles, and there are 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And under each principle is a set of guidelines. Under each guideline is a number of success criterion, and under each success criterion are a number of techniques. Now, the techniques are what you as developers should be looking at. The techniques documentation is about 800 pages long, but it says quite specific things like use float layouts in certain cases, or use alt attributes for images, use table headers for tables, etc. There are 3 documents that you would find useful. There's WCAG2, which talks about principles, guidelines, success criterion. There's Understanding WCAG2, which is a more kind of friendly document and is something that you might find useful in terms of pulling out information to show to management. It talks about the intent of success criterion, so exactly why you should follow a particular requirement, who it would help and how, etc. And then the techniques, which are quite specific code techniques and are broken up into things like general techniques, HTML techniques, JavaScript techniques, Flash techniques, etc. There are 5 conformance requirements. So there are 3 conformance levels in WCAG2, level A, AA and AAA. A is the minimum, AA is the medium level and AAA is the highest. Full pages must be compliant. So you can't say this page is accessible with the exception of the footer. Complete processes must be accessible. So you can't, if you've got a shopping cart site, you can't say the shopping cart is accessible except for the credit card page because it's a full process. And only accessibility supported ways of using technologies. So this has to do with WCAG2 being technology neutral. It's up to policymakers such as the Australian Government Information Management Office and the Australian Human Rights Commission to determine what technologies are accessibility supported and what aren't. There was an inquiry into PDFs that was conducted about a year ago, which deemed that PDFs were not an accessible supported technology. So if you have any content in PDF, you need to have it also in HTML, Word, text or RTF. They also deemed that JavaScript and Flash are not accessibility supported technologies, so you need to have an HTML fallback. There is a proviso clause in the Disability Discrimination Act about systems that are completely reliant on JavaScript, so you're talking about web applications, and in that case they say you need to bring an expert, an accessibility specialist on board to make sure you're doing it in an accessible way. And the other important part is non-interference. It's very important that if you do use technologies that are not accessibility supported, that you do so in a way that they don't actually interact badly with a user's assistive technology. So one of the things that is different between WCAG1 and WCAG2 is a discussion about CAPTCHA. Who here doesn't know what CAPTCHA is? Oh, that's good. It's amazing how many sessions I run where I ask that question and there are people that don't know. So CAPTCHAs are notoriously inaccessible. The problem with the CAPTCHA is that it's a visual test. Now, you can provide an audio CAPTCHA, but I'm yet to actually come across one that is actually accessible. There is something called accessible reCAPTCHA. It's not accessible. One of my staff, he's sysadmin, he uses a magnifier to use a computer, and we all use Gmail, and he can't actually set up Gmail accounts for me because Gmail has a CAPTCHA when it comes to setting up an account. Now, it also has an audio CAPTCHA at that point, but it doesn't work for a variety of reasons. So the rule with CAPTCHA with WCAG2 is that if you have a CAPTCHA in one particular sensory modality, then you need to provide a CAPTCHA in a different sensory modality. So theoretically, if you have a visual CAPTCHA, you should also provide an audio CAPTCHA. But my recommendation to my clients is not to use CAPTCHA at all, and instead to use a human test question, such as, is fire hot or cold? Or is grass green or purple? And that's something that anyone can answer, whether they're visually impaired or not. Another top change is that captions for videos are required at the minimum level. So in WCAG1, you could get away with having an accessible alternative for content. So if you had a video, it actually said that you should have captions, but if you didn't have captions, then a transcript was sufficient. In WCAG2, for all video, you must have captions. Now, captions are different to subtitles. Subtitles are a direct translation from one language to another. Captions actually include sounds as well. So you will actually see across the bottom things like car screeching or, bird singing, etc., etc. Audio descriptions are also recommended at the minimum level. Audio descriptions are a description in audio of the visual content of the video. So if there's any text in the video, or if someone's drawing a diagram or something like that, then it's actually spoken in audio in another track. However, you can get away with not providing audio descriptions at the minimum level. You must always provide a transcript though. Audio control. So another important part of WCAG2 is the ability to control audio. So if you have video, you must actually be able to control the audio from that video separate to system volume. So you must always, if you're creating a video player, you must always allow the user to modify the audio. Sensory characteristics. So there was a requirement in WCAG1 about the use of colour. And so they said you couldn't use colour alone to convey information. So the most common use of this is the fields in red are mandatory. Now, people who are red-blue colourblind, they can't tell the difference between red text on a white background and black text on a white background. So they wouldn't know which fields were mandatory. Now, it was argued with WCAG2 that the same occurs with things like direction. So clicking the button in the bottom right-hand corner is not useful to someone who's using a screen reader and cannot actually see the screen. And also for things like the triangles mean this thing and the squares mean another. So that's another requirement in WCAG2 that you need to be careful of in terms of saying where things are or referring to things in terms of a spatial location. Skip links. So skip to content links are quite useful. They're useful mostly for people who use magnifiers. So they see a very small area of the screen, and so they get to the skip to content link and they can activate it and go straight to the content. Now that means that the skip to content links need to be visible. There is a clause in WCAG2 that allows that skip links only become visible when they are tabbed to, but I personally don't think that's a very user-friendly way of doing things. So you need to make sure that you have skip to content links. And they need to be the first focusable link on the page, and preferably they need to be on the left-hand side. The other thing that still stands is you need to call it a skip to main content or skip to the content, because screen readers, they tend to read the word content, if you have it as skip to content, as skip to content, as in contentment. And we can't really offer that as web designers and developers. So skip to main content or the content. And validation. The other thing to remember with WCAG2 is that it still does require validation. It just doesn't say so in a very clear way. Unless you're very, very skilled in accessibility, the best way to actually comply with a success criterion 4.1.1 is to validate your code. And so that is the best way to do it. One of the things that you can do is if you have accessibility features that break validation, then that's fine. But in general, make sure your code is valid. Pause, stop, hide is another addition. So movement can be quite distracting, and you need to be able to pause, stop or hide it. And you need to be able to do so via the keyboard as well as via the mouse. Timing. So timing was actually a requirement that I recommended adding to WCAG2 because I did some work with the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games, and we had this automated ticketing tool, or not automated, but this ticketing tool, and you had 6 minutes to choose your tickets and pay for them. And in our user testing, we found that people who use screen readers, they couldn't actually fill out all the forms, fill out all the fields in those 6 minutes. But technically, the ticketing system did comply with WCAG1 because there were no timing issues with WCAG1. So with WCAG2, they've gone a little bit overboard, but with timing, there are a number of different options. So you can allow the user to increase the time limit before they encounter it. You can ask the user if they want to increase the time limit before they get to the end of their time limit. And I think there are real-time exceptions for things like auctions. So, you know, if you've got an eBay site, for example, you don't have to allow people with disabilities extra time because it's a real-time exception. Information and relationships. is by far the most complex success criterion. Even though it's one success criterion, there are a number of different techniques underneath it that you really need to look for. I've written an article for sitepoint.com about information and relationships, so feel free to look that up and that will go into it in more detail. But essentially what it means is that you need to code headings, they need to be nested properly, you need to use table headers for data tables, you shouldn't use table headers for layout tables, you should use caption and summary for data tables, you should mark up quotations using the Q and the block quote element, and you should mark up fields with label 4 and ID. Another requirement with WCAG2 is page titles. So every page should have a unique title within a website. So I don't know how many of you are working on really large websites, but that can be problematic. So the requirements are that the page title is unique, that it references the site, and that it's concise, which is sometimes, you know, paradoxical to the unique requirement. So there is a little bit of movement in that particular success criterion, but just make sure every single page you have is titled. Another requirement is error identification. So if you have a form and you can submit that form without any content and nothing happens, then you're in violation of this particular success criterion. Whenever you submit a form that's in error, you need to make sure that error identification is clear and simple and that text is provided as to what the errors are and where the errors occur. The error text should be within the actual label element itself, the relevant label element. And so yes, the one particular interesting part is if you have a search form and you submit an empty string, and nothing happens. Theoretically, you could argue that the website knows that you have put that form in error, and so at that point you need to actually identify that to the user and say, you know, did you mean to put some content in this form, and give them some information there. Another requirement is link purpose. There are two requirements when it comes to link purpose. One's at level A and one's at AAA. When it comes to WCAG1, there was only one link purpose requirement, and it was at AA. And it required that all your links made sense out of context. So as people who use screen readers, which are used by people with vision impairments, that read aloud the text on the page, one of the ways they would navigate is by pulling all the links out of the page and then scanning the links and seeing what was useful to them. So you can imagine if you have a lot of click here links or read more links, then it wouldn't be useful to them. Now, unfortunately in WCAG2, they kind of split this requirement, and there's a requirement at level A that the link purpose makes sense in programmatically determined context versus AAA where the link purpose makes sense out of context. But essentially what it means is that you still need to be very aware of your link text, and in some cases, so for example where you have a list of documents and you've got them in different versions, PDFs and Words and Word documents and etc., that in most cases you need to make sure your link text makes sense out of context. Keyboard and keyboard traps. Now this is another area that WCAG1 didn't cover at all. But it's one of the best ways you can determine whether your website is accessible is seeing whether you can use it with just a keyboard. There are keyboard traps that you need to be wary of, especially with media players or image galleries. Often you can activate a media player or activate an image gallery with your keyboard by pressing enter or tab or something like that. But once you've activated it, you can't actually stop it or escape from it. And so that would be a keyboard trap, and the only way a user who is reliant on a keyboard could escape from that keyboard trap is to actually close the browser and reopen it. So the other area of keyboard interaction that is required is that when you have some kind of interaction on mouse hover, so say a link gets underlined or the background colour changes or something like that, that same interaction needs to occur when you tab to the link. So on top of saying having flyover menus and things like that, which need to be accessible to the keyboard, and all the options need to be accessible via the keyboard. They also need to change colour if that's what you have on mouse hover. And these things remain the same. The site needs to work with style sheets off. So you need to turn off style sheets. One of the biggest errors I see are people using slideshows on their home pages. When you turn style sheets off, the slideshow remains and it moves the content up and down. The same thing sometimes occurs with JavaScript flyover menus. The JavaScript remains when you turn style sheets off, and content pops up and pops down and moves all the content around. So one of the best things that you can do is have some kind of mechanism in your site that determines whether style sheets are on or off. And if style sheets are off, you automatically disable JavaScript. PDFs, as I mentioned, are still inaccessible. There are 3 reasons why PDFs are inaccessible. The design of the PDF. There is not actually a definition as to what an accessible PDF is, but in general, a PDF that is not tagged is not accessible. Tagging PDFs is a very time-consuming, laborious process, and there are very, very few tagged PDFs out there. Secondly, the skill of the end user. So often, in order to use a PDF, the end user needs to learn a whole set of different techniques with their assistive technology than if they're using a web page. And thirdly, the actual assistive technology itself often doesn't work as well with a PDF as it does with HTML. So, for example, I did some work for Department of Business and Innovation, and they had some smart forms that they wanted me to test. I sent it to one of my screen reader users, and he couldn't open the form. So that was it, he just couldn't open it. I sent it to another screen reader user. The only difference is that this guy had been using screen readers for probably an extra 10 years, but both of them used their screen readers for 8 hours plus a day. He could open it, but when it came to the radio buttons, he couldn't select any. So there was nothing that he could do, and when I looked at the code of the PDF, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the coding. It was coded properly, it was the assistive technology that was the problem. So PDFs are still inaccessible, and it is something that is a big problem for a lot of my clients. And JavaScript must always have an HTML fallback. Now, I'm not sure how long this is going to be required, because JavaScript in a lot of ways does have quite a few accessibility features. Also, I am finding that a lot of my users, they tend to leave JavaScript on when they're using a site with assistive technology. So therefore, instead of just making sure that your site works with JavaScript disabled and works, of course, with JavaScript enabled, you need to make sure that your site works with JavaScript enabled and an assistive technology. So it can be a little bit complex. There are lots of things lots of information that you can get on accessibility. WebAIM is a great site called Web Accessibility in Mind. They just did a recent analysis of skip links on the web, and they found that over 50% of skip links on the web were broken or didn't work. So let's see if we can change that. The W3C Web Accessibility Initiative is where you'll get all the WCAG documents. They do have an interesting little system where you can say, okay, I want all the level A requirements, only HTML, and it spits you out a less complex series of documents that you can then print out. The other thing, even though this is WCAG1 relevant, is it's still useful, is the e-government accessibility toolkit. I was commissioned to write it for Victorian Government in 2001, and I've updated it every 2 years. At the moment, Department of Business Innovation and Department of Treasury and Finance are arguing over who gets to pay for the next version. So it's still all about WCAG1, but it is quite useful, and there is a lot of stuff there about why accessibility is important, the different types of people with disabilities that are assisted by an inaccessible site, business cases and things like that if you need to get management on board. There's some great sites about Drupal accessibility, and I have a blog which occasionally I update. Probably the most relevant thing on there recently have been the articles that I've written for SitePoint. One about information and relationships, and 2 about alt attributes. And I also have a Twitter account. So we're fairly early, but does anyone have any questions? Go ahead.
Adobe appeared to have made some moves recently with PDF, particularly with the ability to tag from InDesign 5.5. Are you saying that what they've been doing recently still doesn't help really with the accessibility, or is it just the readers are not keeping up, or is it a combination of both?
It's the combination. So did everyone hear that question? Did anyone not hear that question? Okay. So Adobe has been doing some good things. It is one of the questions that the PDF inquiry asked the assistive technologies was, are you planning to make PDFs more, accessible to your technology? And they said, look, quite frankly, in terms of return on investment, it makes sense for us to work on making sure our assistive technology works with JavaScript as opposed to working with tagged PDFs, because there are so few tagged PDFs out there. So it's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing. The biggest problem is not actually that Adobe isn't providing the ability to do this tagging, it's that the tagging itself is so complex and it's buggy. So I do tagging as part of my work, and it's much more time consuming to create a tagged PDF than it would be to create an accessible HTML version. And until Adobe makes that system easier, then you're going to have a problem. So it's really, but you're right, it's a combination. They are doing some good things, but it's going to be time until those assistive technology manufacturers catch up, and there's no real incentive for them to do so if you guys, if the authors out there aren't tagging PDFs.
Hi, my question is on the CAPTCHA method that you said about the text-based question. We were trying to troubleshoot this particular problem. The user said the CAPTCHA was not coming through, and it's a math-based CAPTCHA. When we looked at it, the technical folks were not able to understand where the problem was. But as we studied it further and found out how the user was, not able to get the question, the CAPTCHA correctly, we found out it was like a math CAPTCHA was like 1 + 0, and they were just typing in back as 1 + 0, right? So as we studied it further, we found it's more like CAPTCHA as a word kind of means repeat, in the understanding of people, it's basically repeat what is written there, not whether, so in the question, in the way you've approached it with the suggested method of the text-based question, do you find people just repeating the question?
Now, was it you that suggested the human test question? I remember because it was someone at Monash. So I remember someone had this brilliant idea at Monash. I worked at Monash for a few years. The answer is we don't call it a CAPTCHA. So I've never come across someone who would type in hot or cold to the is fire hot or cold. At Monash, they actually say, we need to make sure you're a human and not a spam bot. So can you please answer this question? So that's one way to get around it.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Well, look, because I think CAPTCHA, the meaning associated with CAPTCHA is now coming, the general audience thinks it is basically repeat what is written.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you put a math CAPTCHA or anything, they just repeat it, so.
Yeah, and look, I think the world would be a better place without CAPTCHAs.
Yeah.
So it's funny because I used to think the world would be a better place without Flash, so it's amazing how things change. But yeah, I would say just don't even bother using the word CAPTCHA. The whole point is to make sure the person's not a spam bot, not to make sure that you're using a CAPTCHA. So the more people I can convince not to use CAPTCHAs, the better.
All right. I was wondering what's the best way for developers to test out their websites with assistive technologies, and which ones should we be testing for?
Okay, so with assistive technologies, I wouldn't recommend that you do a lot of testing yourself. And the reason why is because the way you would use an assistive technology is different to the way a person with a particular disability who relies on that technology would use it. So for example, you could use a screen reader over your site. Let's take Google for an example. And it'll read out everything as required, and you'll go, okay, fantastic, it reads it out. But the one thing that you won't pick up is that the links at the bottom, you know how it says 1, 2, 3, 4 to indicate search pages after the first one? That's obvious to you because you can see it in visual context. It's not obvious to screen reader users. So there is There is some value in doing it. You might realise that, say, your field labels aren't created properly, but the best way to do it is to make sure your site is WCAG2 compliant. The other thing that you can do is just make sure you can use your site using a keyboard. There is a great free assistive technology, a free screen reader called NVDA, which was actually built by a Monash student, which certainly is worth having a look at. So I suppose I'm saying you can use these things, but don't necessarily think that you're going to be replacing that kind of testing. There's an inbuilt magnifier for Windows, which is also useful in terms of looking at things. Yep.
Hi Gian, I have a bit of a left field question, and it's really about the opposite side of accessibility, and that is, and I've picked it up really from the fact that screen readers aren't catching up with some of the technologies. What's the alternative? Can we look at maybe crowdsourcing development that actually solves some of these problems so that accessibility isn't such an issue?
Well, that's where the Monash guy who built NVDA came in. So he basically said JAWS, which was the most common screen reader until NVDA came out, is $1,000. It's just prohibitively expensive. The problem is that people buy a version of JAWS and they don't upgrade it, so you've got people using JAWS that are 5 or 6 years old. So this guy went ahead and built a free screen reader, which quite a few people prefer in preference to JAWS. It is an excellent product. So certainly it is possible to do these kind of things. And NVDA was incorporated in the testing of the PDF inquiry, and it dealt with PDFs just as well, if not better, with JAWS. With PDFs. So in answer to your question, I'm sure there is something that can be done, but it requires a lot of effort. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is building an automated testing tool, and the amount of effort that is required to kind of bring that to fruition, and this is something that I do for a living. I think that it's maybe a little bit too much to ask for people who already have day jobs. Yeah.
My point is, I suppose it must be a commercial viability to something like this.
Yeah, and look, this is why, I'm very vocal on the subject of Adobe PDFs and how they're not accessible. If you're at all interested, Gian Wild, I've written the outcomes of the PDF inquiry, and Adobe responded, and they were quite narky. But I'm known to be aggressive when it comes to PDFs. And I do think Adobe has gone above and beyond in some ways when it comes to PDFs. But the reason why I am is because I believe that Adobe are the only organisation that can fix this problem. So I'm going to be aggressive about PDFs and keep pushing Adobe to say, you need to do better, because quite frankly, they're the only ones that can make their system easier to use. So I'm not sure how much, the best thing that you can do is tag your PDFs. But as I said, that's a complicated thing to do. And I'm running Melbourne Accessibility Week, 6th to the 10th of February, and one of the training sessions I'm running is tagging PDFs. So, that's really the only thing when it comes to PDFs that I can really recommend. I think it needs to come from the big organisations who have funding, who might even be able to give those screen reader manufacturers some money and say, hey, spend some money on making sure you actually work with PDFs. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you, great talk. Thank you for bringing light to a subject that needs to had light brung to it. However, going to be set up. Why do I have to stand up? No. Just because of my jacket. What I wanted to say was, the talk that you gave is great, but if I didn't know, I'm heavily into WCAG stuff, and I've had to be playing with ARIA roles and everything else recently for a project that we're doing with media access. And if I listen to your talk, I think that from a JavaScript perspective, and what I find when some people talk about accessibility is they go on about JavaScript, and it tends to scare developers and designers into thinking that web accessible sites need to look shit and have no JavaScript. But realistically, poor written JavaScript isn't accessible. However, well-written JavaScript is highly accessible. And it's also shown that people that have screen readers, only like 2% or something of them, so actually less then the average community that's turning off their JavaScript screen readers are turning it off less than them. So do you have any maybe positive notes to send out to the development and design community that sites can be sexy and accessible to?
Well, so on the sexiness, I run a professional company, right? And I made I hope it's professional. I made a very specific decision to make it as interesting as possible. So if you see my slides, my entire website is like that. So I really do want to break the mould that it has to be a text-only site. A text-only site is inaccessible. It really is. So you can make things interesting, you can make them funky and still have them accessible. In answer to the JavaScript question, yes, there are a lot of things that you can do with JavaScript. It's a great technology in a lot of ways. It's certainly much more accessible than it was a couple of years ago. The only reason I say you need to make sure that your site works with JavaScript disabled is because that's what the Australian Human Rights Commission says. So if you get a complaint about your website because it uses JavaScript, you actually don't have a leg to stand on, because the Australian Human Rights Commission has quite specifically said JavaScript is not an accessible technology. Now, they might not actually be correct. They've just made that comment. They haven't got any research to back that up. They also made the comment that Word documents are accessible. Once again, there was no research to back that up, and you need to do quite a lot of things to make a Word document accessible. But because they said it, then it's written in stone. So that's why my argument, my recommendation to you is, if you are doing something like a brochureware site that doesn't need JavaScript, use JavaScript, but always have an HTML fallback. If it's easy enough to have an HTML fallback, then do so. But if you're starting to build things like a trim web interface, which I'm reviewing at the moment, then obviously you have to use JavaScript. And at that point, what the Australian Human Rights Commission says is bring in an expert to make sure that you are actually doing things as well as possible. But on the JavaScript topic, I would say in the next 2 years, there will be a change of decision in terms of how accessible JavaScript is, because there are a lot of accessibility specialists in Australia that are essentially saying, hey, people are starting to browse, with JavaScript, and you're right, there are more people in the general public who turn off JavaScript than people who use screen readers that turn off JavaScript. So you need to make sure, much more important, that your system works with JavaScript on with the assistive technology than with JavaScript off with the assistive technology. I don't know if that answered your question, but... I love your presentation. I think that you brought up a lot of good points about accessibility, and to the disabled and people, and expand the definition of what being disabled means, which I thought was great. And I also had a lot of conversations with people here about accessibility and kind of how it overlaps with search engine optimization, and how it helps broaden the spectrum of people who can actually use your website. But I was kind of wondering if you can expand a little bit, I'm obviously American, so on the kind of laws in Australia, and how, whether or not, are these standards just for government and nonprofit, or just for government-run websites, because they do provide those essential services for everybody, or do these standards go out to the broader base, to the kind of private enterprise and the corporate enterprise, and if they don't, would you like to see that happen? Okay, so we're a little bit different than in America. In America, there's the Section 508, which requires that government systems or systems purchased by government are accessible. There's also the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has some accessibility requirements. In Australia, the thing that requires that you make your site accessible is the Australian Human Rights Commission Disability Discrimination Act. They have a page called the Web Advisory Notes, which I recommend you reading. It's quite long. If you don't want to read the whole thing, I've got a summary on my blog. And it talks about all the various different things, but the biggest things to take out of it is that you should use WCAG2, that accessibility is required by everybody. So corporates, government, local government, state government, Joe Blogg's fish and chip shop down the road. Everything that is from an Australian organisation and or placed on an Australian server needs to be accessible. So at Monash, they have a South African campus, and there was a question of whether that South African website needed to be accessible to Australian standards. And the legal team decided that yes, even though it was hosted in South Africa, it was an Australian organisation and therefore needed to be accessible.
Quick follow-up to that. Do you think that possibly that it could kind of set a dangerous precedent, having the government run web standards? Thinking though, you can use an example, maybe Microsoft having contracts with big kind of corporate tech companies. Even though it's a great, it's a great idea and it's something we should all adopt and definitely put into our coding standards. But do you think there might be a little bit of a danger there, having the government kind of set web standards that we all have to follow?
Well, the WCAG2 is an international standard, so making your site WCAG2 compliant pretty much would make your site accessible across the world. There are different standards, but most of them are based on WCAG2, so you're fairly safe if you make your site WCAG2 compliant. I just want to mention the concept of unjustifiable hardship. So if you can prove that it's unjustifiably hard to make your site accessible, then you don't need to do so. So you could argue, if you're, Joe's Fish and Chip Shop, that you paid someone $500 to make make your website, and you did not have the resources to make it accessible. And that would be a defence if someone made a complaint about your site. However, the unjustifiable hardship clause is not available to state, local or federal government, and money cannot be used as a reason, which kind of begs the question, because theoretically any site can be made accessible with enough money. The Sydney Operating Commission for the Olympic Games used money as a reason as to why their site was not accessible. And even though they were kind of a government entity but not a government department, they were the judge deemed that the unjustifiable hardship clause did not apply to them. So even though you've got government saying these are all the requirements, there are, I suppose, get out of jail free cards for people that are in kind of difficult situations.
My question is sort of rather expands on the last question, and you almost alluded it to just then. Do you know of any precedent court cases or litigation that has set a standard for or reaching better accessibility in Australia? Yeah,
so in Australia there's the Sydney Operating Commission for the Olympic Games case. It was in 1999, a vision impaired user couldn't use the SOCOG website. They used JavaScript for navigation, and they had images of tables of data as opposed to coding data tables, God knows why. And they were told that they needed to fix these things. They didn't. It ended up in court. The Supreme Court fined them $20,000, which is not a lot of money, but it was essentially deemed that it would have cost them $10,000 to make their site accessible, so they doubled the fee. However, their legal costs were in excess of $500,000, and they landed on the front page of every single newspaper in Australia. And that was why the Commonwealth Games actually engaged my firm more than 2 years before the Commonwealth Games came to Melbourne, because they were so afraid the same thing would happen to them. Obviously, it didn't. Well, I don't know if it's obvious or not. We didn't get a single accessibility complaint. That's the only actual legal case in Australia. However, there are a lot of things, unfortunately, there are a lot of rumours about accessibility mediation. So what tends to happen is someone gets a complaint, goes to the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Australian Human Rights Commission mediates it out, and money tends to change hands. And whether that's, I've heard, ranges from $20,000 to $30,000, as well as things like, I know one client of mine, they came to me after they received the complaint, they had 5,000 PDFs, they needed to make all those PDFs HTML documents, and they had a year to do so. Estimated that cost them $1 million. Now that didn't actually end up going to court, so there's no record of that anywhere, but it was still a requirement. Internationally, by the way, Australia was the first country in the world to have accessibility litigation. In America, there was a lawsuit against Target by a vision impairment organisation, and they were charged $6 million. So it can get quite large.
Yeah, my question is about like automated testing. I know there's no such tool. I wish there was. Have you come across any tools that come close?
Yeah, so I actually am doing the Melbourne Accessibility Week. I've got a one-day conference, and I'm actually doing a demonstration of the 4 best automated testing tools that I've come across, because I've done a review of them. The IBM Policy Tester, which is extraordinarily expensive. There's SSB BART Group, AMP. You can buy a license for $1,495. Sorry, slowly. IBM Policy Tester. And if you're interested, I have relationships with all these companies. So if you're interested in demos, feel free just to contact me and I can pass you on. SSB BART Group, AMP. They're the only company that doesn't have Australian representation, but they also, in terms of price, I think are the best value for money. There's High Software Compliance Sheriff, which was actually built in Australia, although it's an American product. And there's a new one just hit the market called by Funnelback, which is a search engine, called the WCAG Compliance Tester. If you're dealing with small sites, they're all good for really large sites, like thousands of pages. If you're dealing with a small site, I'd recommend SortSite. It's about $300. Anything more than about 1,000 pages, it will crash. In terms of automated testing tools, obviously I do this for a living. I find most of my projects are auditing websites. Most of the sites I deal with are very, very large. So I'm going to be building my own automated testing tool. That doesn't mean that the stuff out there isn't useful. It just means it doesn't do exactly what I want it to do. And this is my bread and butter. So that's why I'm going to build my own. But they're all good in their own ways.
Can I just extend on that from my interest point? How many of those are cross-platform tools?
That's a good question. They're all web-based, so theoretically they would work on both. It's interesting because I used to use a Mac and I moved back to the PC for a variety of reasons. But it's amazing how things still sometimes don't work on the Mac. But yeah, they're all web-based, so they should all work. Yeah.
Did you say Wave and the Vision Australia, the new Vision Australia toolbar?
Yeah, so this woman was saying the Wave and the Vision Australia toolbar, they're not useful for automated testing, so they're page by page. There is a good section in the e-government toolkit about automated testing tools, which is a little bit obsolete now, but there is a really good section about the page by page accessibility testing tools. By far the best one is Wave, which is wave.webaim.org. They are actually looking at creating an automated version that will test an entire site. They're talking about releasing it at CSUN in February. What I use is the Firefox Web Developer Toolbar. I think that's absolutely brilliant, but there's one very similar called the Vision Australia Accessibility Toolbar. So those are and the W3C validators, the HTML validator and the CSS validator, I find very useful.
First of all, thank you for your time. It's fantastic to have someone like you here. I'd like to go back to the topic of PDFs because I'd like your guidance on that. PDFs were, as a technology based on PostScript, and it was really never meant to be a visual medium. So wouldn't it be better if we require alternatives instead of trying to force a technology into something that it wasn't meant to be in the first place? And I think, if I were to make an analogy, we don't make cars possible for blind people to drive, even though we have the technology to do that. So, as someone who used to publish magazines, I mean, it's not possible for me to transfer, the printed medium to a non-visual person. It's just not possible. I can provide an alternative, which I think is a very important thing to do, but I just don't understand this push to make PDF work in the same way that HTML does, because the two things are just totally different.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that I think it's far more preferable. HTML has a number of accessibility features that PDF will never have. So I think that if you're dealing with a PDF document, make it accessible HTML. That's by far the best preference. Adobe wants to say that PDF is an accessible technology. And it was something that I brought up at Accessing Higher Ground in Colorado last year, that I actually think there should be two versions of PDF. There should be PDF and there should be accessible PDF, and that you can, and it might have a different logo, it might even have a different extension, so that people can easily see when they look at your site, you have two versions. You have PDF and you have an accessible PDF, because the accessible PDF, it's going to be larger, it's going to take more time, etc., etc. And that way people can easily see from the website perspective that, hey, your website has accessible PDFs, when there isn't necessarily any kudos in tagging a PDF at the moment, because there's no way that you can really tell the users, other than saying, hey, we've tagged our PDF, that you've gone to the trouble of making an accessible PDF. So yes, I have been pushing for this concept of accessible PDF as an alternate format, but it hasn't gotten very far. Though I did notice that Andrew Kirkpatrick, who is the accessibility guy in Adobe, is now following my Twitter stream, so.
This will have to be the last question, sorry. So.
Well, I hope it's a good one.
It better be.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on HTML5? On one hand, it does provide lots of accessible like semantic code, but on the other hand, from a technology point of view, not everyone has access, or not everyone uses browsers that are compatible with HTML5.
Yeah, so this is a question that gets asked a lot at my development training sessions, because I don't talk about HTML5 at all at my development training sessions. The thing of HTML5 is going to be great in about 3 years' time. The problem is that you can't rely on browsers to support it properly. And if you can't rely on browsers to support it properly, there's no way you can rely on assistive technology to support it properly. So by all means, use HTML5. All my sites are HTML5 compliant, but they all have HTML4 fallbacks. And that's the way that I would recommend that you go at this point. And it's certainly, I'd say it's a few years away before you can start making pure HTML5 sites and know that they're going to be accepted by everyone. There you go, that was an easy last question.